Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Rohit Kumar, and I've had 4 hours of sleep.
And I'm Janice Mays, and I'm awake now. We are filming the morning after the 2024 presidential election. And for the most part, we know where things stand. We'll, of course, follow up on the unknowns, but for today, we're going to focus on what we know and the next steps.
Now, no matter what side of the political aisle you sit, this has been an intense election cycle. There's still a lot to process, so we might as well start today. Former President Trump won his bid to return to the White House. We will have a Senate Republican majority with at least 52 seats, 6 races undecided as of this filming. The House remains too close to call, with several races as yet undecided, leaving the question of divided government versus unified government still very much up in the air. Joining us for this conversation today is Scott McCandless. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So I'll kick it off by saying, look, I'm surprised that as we sit here the morning after the election, we are able to discuss who won the presidential election. As you know, in 2020, it wasn't until the Saturday after that we knew who the president was. So Scott, I want to start with you.
Sure.
What are your observations from last night?
Sure. Well, Rohit, as you said at the top, sleep was in short supply last night. I actually got a call this morning, one of the many conversations we've already had, asking, are you tired? And interestingly, I took that as kind of a loaded question. Are you tired not just because we didn't get much sleep last night, but are you also tired because it's been such a long campaign? It feels like this has gone on for years, and it's almost a surprise that it's essentially over. We still have some races undecided, but for the most part, the fact that it is over in the first night is a huge surprise. So that was the first observation. The second is that President Trump, for only the second time in U.S. history do we have a president winning a second term, but non-consecutive, kind of interesting. But he also seems, perhaps mandate is a bit too strong of a word, but he got a bigger win than perhaps some expected, seems to have won the popular vote and put together a rather diverse coalition, both in terms of the people that were aligned with him up on stage, but also in terms of those who delivered the votes to him. So I think it's kind of interesting to see what momentum that might carry into 2025, if any. And that was one of the first things that jumped out at me as we were watching the returns.
Yeah. Janice?
I think he was the agent of change. I think she could never convince people she would be different from Biden in a big way. They're unhappy with the economy, they're unhappy with other things, and that was something that he could be, that agent for change.
Yeah, look, I mean, I was just looking at the results. Even the states that Trump didn't carry, he just substantially narrowed the margin. Like New Jersey obviously voted for Vice President Harris, but by a 4-point margin. Right? That's a dramatic shift. Mm-hmm. Right? We always think of, those of us who worked on Capitol Hill, we always think of New Jersey as just a very blue state. It's always going to vote for the Democrat. That happened again. But the margins are shrinking across the board. This was a pretty diverse coalition, gains with Latino voters across the board, districts that hadn't voted for a Republican in 100 years, voting Republican this time around. So it'll be interesting to see this realignment that's happening amongst the parties. How does that play out over the next couple of years, I think remains to be seen.
And whether it's durable.
Right. Is this a single, the sort of cult of one person, mm-hmm. or is this sort of a durable change in the alignment of the parties? That, I think, is way too early to tell.
Absolutely. Time will tell, though. At some point, we'll know that. Well, Scott, let's continue to look ahead a little bit. What do you think are the biggest unknowns we still have out there?
Sure. Well, politically, the biggest unknown you mentioned at the top is that we don't quite know who's going to control the House of Representatives, and therefore we don't know who's going to control Congress, and therefore we don't know whether there will have to be some kind of divided government bipartisan deal to address tax issues next year, or whether reconciliation will in fact be on the table as a vehicle to try to move that forward. So that remains a huge question. That's not a terribly big surprise. Like you said, sometimes we don't know the presidential election right away. This time we do. But with the House, it's not uncommon to have many races still outstanding. The only issue this time is that the narrowness of the House is such that control is in the balance, as opposed to whether you have 30 or 40 seats, a few outstanding races doesn't really matter. Here, it's going to have huge impact. So that's the biggest question that we're still waiting to have answered. And unfortunately, it might be a little while before we know that conclusion.
Yeah, in 2022, they were counting votes in California until December. Right. So I think, there's no reason to think that it'll be any faster this time around. In 2022, control was established relatively early. Yeah. Margin is what became the issue, and margins matter, right? I'd ask Kevin McCarthy about margins. Like, margins do matter quite a bit. But here, if all of the candidates that are leading today kind of end up winning, you're talking about a 219, 216, or maybe 220, 215 result. Mm-hmm. So and some of those leads are like, very, very thin. Right. So really control. It is not too much to say that control is still very much in question when it comes to the House. Look, I know we've all been taking a lot of incoming this morning. Mm-hmm. questions, concerns, all of that. I'm curious, has there been a consistent theme in the questions you've been getting so far, or are they kind of all over the map?
One theme that I'm getting consistently is timing, and it really has two flavors to it. One is the timing of when exactly Congress will move forward, whether it's divided government or single party control, when will it move forward? And there's a little bit of expectation management that needs to go on with that conversation, because I've talked to some clients and sometimes they just simply assume, they presume in their question to me, the tax reform is going to happen almost immediately in 2025. I think that is very generous. I think we're looking at a much longer timeline for tax reform or tax changes, the tax law, to actually get underway. I'm sure the staff will have the process well in hand, but for us to actually see a bill, see it debated, see changes to it, I think it's going to take some time, and I think that's something that we get a lot of questions about. But the other issue of timing, the other flavor that the timing question comes in, is when these changes will be effective. For instance, they said, well, if the corporate rate were to change, when would that be effective? Is that a January 1, 2026? And that plays out for a variety of provisions that could potentially be in the conversation, whether that's the excise tax on stock buybacks or corporate alternative minimum tax or the international provisions, mainly from a business perspective, of course. But what would be the effectiveness of those provisions, and when would they come into effect? So timing is the one theme, and I'm hearing it from two different ways.
Janice, what are you taking in terms of incoming this morning?
I'm getting much the same. People think it should all be decided, and they expect we will have, even when it's all decided, we still won't know timing. We won't know these things. We know that the goals of the House Republicans to get it all done and signed by the president by April 30th are aspirational. I'm with you. That's a lot to do early on, and that means within your party, if you've run the tables everywhere, within your party, you've got to agree on everything and do a budget that accommodates that. It takes a while to get there. And then if it is divided government, it's at least the end of the year before we kind of know these answers, because they've got to start speaking to each other again, and then they've got to start negotiating to find the middle ground.
Yeah, I'm definitely getting the, certainly some clients are looking at who's leading, and they're projecting Republicans are going to keep the House, and that could happen. But even amongst Republicans, they start $4.7 trillion apart from each other, right? There are Senate Republicans who say we should essentially be able to deficit finance all of the extensions. You've got some House Republicans who say we should pay for every penny of the extension. Neither will probably end up being true, even if Republicans run the table. Neither will be true. It won't be entirely deficit financed. It won't be entirely paid for. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. And then, of course, there's this other variable, which is who does President Trump nominate and get confirmed as Treasury Secretary? Who's running the National Economic Council? Who are his sort of delegates to Congress to go negotiate all of this out, starting with, in a Republican sweep, what does the reconciliation instruction look like? In divided government, I agree. This becomes, I think, in all likelihood, a Q4 2025 event, because both sides will just have to take these principled stands up until the moment they have to start negotiating.
And Scott, you're going to keep having a lot of conversations today and going forward. What are the one or two things that you're going to tell companies to keep in mind, to have kind of front of mind in that context?
Sure. This is really, pedal to the floor here in terms of the effort. I know that a lot of companies have been going up either individually or through associations to which they belong to talk to members of Congress, making submissions to the tax team portal and the Ways and Means Committee and so forth. But the effort has really just been almost prefatory at this point. You really need to ramp up the pressure, making the case. And making the case, I think they've given us the contours of what they want to hear. It's not just the extent to which your provision makes the United States more competitive. That is almost esoteric to a lot of the folks on the Hill at this point. It needs to be granular to the point of how does this help people, especially because Republicans have already warned us that even if it's unitary government, there is going to be an emphasis on the individual side of the code, potentially at the expense of the corporate side, although that is still too early to say. I don't want to get over our skis on that. And I think that's a very important message that they still have to hammer home.
Scott, thanks for joining us and giving us your thoughts today.
Look, we are far from done with analyzing the results of this year's election, and we'll be here to guide you through it. We appreciate you spending this time with us this morning. Take care.